Welcome, another episode. Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Thanks, sponsors. Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication, ComC.com, Heritage Auctions, Huggins & Scott Auctions, Burbank Sports Cards, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Topps, Panini, and Upper Deck. So thank you all. Today, talking about I'm calling it confidence in grading. It's kind of a little bit of a catch-all, provoked somewhat by a nice idea from Ken Capel, just talking about the 93 SP Jeter rookie and how the value can be different even in the same number based on whether something were to be graded by PSA versus BGS. And so specifically, I thought, well, let me do a little bit of a treatment. It doesn't specifically answer that question. In fact, if you want to answer that question, you just can look up the sales history to see what where it needs to be. The problem is, if you send in a card, you have to know where to send it. And even if you get a certain grade from one of the companies, you could always send it to the other one and see if you get a better grade. But is a better grade going to be more valuable? In most cases, it will be, but there can be exceptions. So I'm going to give a little statistics lesson here and see if you just follow along. And if not answering the question, at least giving you a way to think about this. So grading, there's people that don't understand grading. It is an art and a science. It's not an exact science. There's always going to be some subjectivity. And not everything is perfectly quantifiable in a way that with an exactitude that is replicable. Even the same person could grade the same card, unbeknownst to them, perhaps. Not if you said, "Hey, the same card you graded yesterday." If you say, "Hey," but if you slipped it in, it's possible that the same grader could even have a slight difference in the grade if they graded it several times. Again, without not one after the other, but randomly stuck in there every so often. But the question is, how much confidence should you have in grading or in a card's face value of a grade? So statistics, what I used to teach, is the science of decision making in the face of uncertainty. And there's a concept in statistics, probably in one of the first courses, about confidence intervals. So I'm going to walk you through a little experiment, and hopefully it'll give you, I'm going to make some assumptions to keep it simple, but hopefully it'll give you a way to think about this that gives you confidence to a certain level of the grading process. So I want you to think about a certain card. So you're going to take a card. It's the uncertain grade, but let's just say for sake of argument that it's a 9. So it's not perfect, but it's a great card. It's mint. It's mint. Okay. But most people would say it's a 9. So I'm going to do 2 experiments. The first experiment is I'm going to give this card to 100 collectors to study it and ascertain a grade. Now I'm assuming each of these 100 collectors has passed a basic grading competency test. So they're not a newbie collector. They've had some level of training, but they're not a professional grader, but a decent amateur, which would be similar to someone who looks at cards at shows and in collections and is able to make reasonable evaluations that are kind of in the ballpark of the final grade that a card would get if it is later submitted to BGS or PSA. I'm going to limit my discussion today just to PSA and BGS because those are kind of recognized as the main 2. I certainly mean no disrespect to SGC and others, but again, just for simplicity, I'm going to limit it to those 2. Anyway, that's the first experiment, that 100 collectors who have some grading competency but are not professional graders, amateur graders. And you're going to see what that card gets in terms of grades from those 100. Second experiment, a second group. You can give that same card, again, it's a 9, to 100 professional graders. Now, the catch here is that there probably aren't that many graders around who are available at BGS and PSA. I don't know if there's 100 professional graders in the whole industry. And just as an editorial statement, apparently there should be. The demand is certainly there with both of those companies having a pretty crazy backlog. But again, for sake of argument with the numbers, I've got 100 graders. So those 100 graders each look at the card, they study the card, they ascertain a grade. Now, again, you need to suspend for a moment the fact that PSA doesn't give 9.5s and just allow that possibility for simplicity's sake. In fact, I made a case in a previous episode about why that might be a pretty good, actually a decent idea for PSA not to give 9.5s, to make it either be a 9 or a 10. But for sake of this experiment, somebody's going to look at the card and they can say it's not quite a 10, but it's better than a 9. It's a 9.5. So I know deep down in your own sensitivity, you know that every one of the professional graders, much less every one of the amateur grader collectors, they're not all going to say it's a 9. And it would be reasonable to expect that the amateur group of graders would have more variability and less consistency, which in statistical terms, that means it would have a larger or greater standard deviation. So again, for sake of argument and simplicity of math, let's assume the amateur group has a standard deviation of 0.5. So that's like a half a point of grading. And the professional group of graders has a tighter standard deviation because they're more accurate, they're more consistent, they're more professional. And so their standard deviation is 0.25, a fourth of a grade. So again, I'm just using those numbers in ways that more easily demonstrate the point I'm trying to make. If the experiment were run, actually, you could actually calculate the standard deviations and it'd be empirically calculable. But anyway, based on these assumptions, you could assume a reasonable assumption is a normal distribution, the famous bell curve. It'd be more like a histogram because it's not a smooth curve. It looks something like the following. You would think that both experimental groups would have a lot of 9s. In fact, we're saying they probably would average out a grade of 9. There'd be some lower, some higher, but the card is a 9. So you'd think of the average grade would be a 9. Might be slightly more, slightly less, but that would, now again, even that is an assumption that is not, may not even be accurate because, it's probably true. If I were to assume, well, I think many of you are unwilling, and I probably am too, to assume that the pro graders are not, well, I think it's pro grade, the people that grade all the time are tougher. They're better able to recognize the flaws. And so even if a card is a 9, the less experienced graders are not going to pick up on some flaws. So there may even be some grade inflation, with less professional graders. And that's what happens when you have, people are looking at their own cards or somebody looks at a card. If they're not a professional grader, they don't see flaws that would, downgrade a card. So the bell curve would suggest with this kind of a distribution that the professionals, that 95% of these 100 would probably fall within 2 standard deviations. That means 95% of the grades that the 100 graders gave, so 95 would have grades that were falling. Again, mostly would be 9s probably, but 2 standard deviations is 2 times 0.25 or a half point. So that would be 95% would fall between an 8.5 and a 9.5. Again, a tighter range. Whereas the amateur grader distribution, the 95% would be within 2 standard deviations, but their standard deviations are more or wider. And so their 95% would be between 8 and a 10. Again, pointing out that if you're an amateur grader, you're maybe not going to be able to see certain flaws because you're not tuned into that, or you might exaggerate a flaw that a professional grader would understand, in context what that is. So clearly it's not an unreasonable assumption that the better graders are more accurate and more consistent. And it's also pretty obvious that not all graders are equal. That's why some are undoubtedly tougher than others. That's why cards are frequently resubmitted in hopes of getting a higher grade. Even a half point can make a huge difference, even from the same grading company. So much less crossing over. So I'm going to give some rules here, which are not necessarily mine, but I've heard it said in these terms about secondary market values, and I'm not approving or disproving, but starting at not the bottom, but at the bottom of what we're talking about here, that a PSA sells for more than a BGS 9 in a vintage card. And a PSA 9 sells for about the same as a BGS 9 for a modern card. And a BGS 9.5 sells for about the same as a PSA 10. And a BGS 10, especially a black label, sells for more than a PSA 10. So again, you could disagree with me. That's fine. There are many who disagree, and there are many who probably will agree to some degree. And again, it's all empirically verifiable. And the lesser grades, you go to 8s and 7s and 6s. Again, PSA, I did hats off to them. Their set registry has really given them, I think, an edge on some of the vintage cards with people trying to complete their sets and keep it in the same. Okay. At any rate, if you take all that to be true, there is an opportunity for crossing over. That if you have a BGS 9 or a PSA 9 you might have your own experiment. Do I want to resubmit that card to the other service? Again, I'm just talking about the two different ones for now. So there's an opportunity, but there's a trap there. I think, again, I'm just putting on my professor hat on. I think that, to me, it's reasonable to assume there probably is a crossover bias of about a half point, a negative 0.5, a half a grade, when you try to submit something that is in the other company's slab. If you put a BGS 9 in the slab and send it to PSA and say, tell me what you think this is, again, that's been explained that it might be human nature. There's lots of different reasons for it, but people believe there's a crossover bias. Okay. On the other hand, if you take the card out of the slab, there should be, they don't know where it came from. They don't know that it was a PSA 9 that got submitted to BGS 9. That might be a 9.5. It might be an 8.5. You just don't know. So, if it's taken out of the slab, especially the other company's slab, then it should be unbiased. Again, that's assuming you can deslab the card without damage, which is not a sure thing. If you've never cracked a slab, you could damage a card. So I've cracked a bunch of slabs and rarely damaged a card, but I have. And I was careful, and I still damaged a card. So be careful. But anyway, the whole point here is that, and the point of the question from Ken, my friend Ken, is that if you're sitting here with a 93 SP Jeter, substantially valuable in higher grades, pretty amazingly valuable, there's an opportunity for what President George W. Bush called strategery. You could decide, could you gain an edge by putting it, what holder should you put it in? And it depends on what grade you get. It's not a foregone conclusion that if you have a 9 card, that it'll get a 9 from PSA and a 9 from BGS. In fact, it could get less or more from either one, and you could get different grades according to which grader you get. And that's part of normal variation, part of the art, not just the science. The other aspect of this is that there's just a time sensitivity of the card values. When you're playing around with whether to put it, especially with some of these newer cards, of which card grading service to use, you've got to factor in the costs and the time it takes, the backlog. Again, most of both these services have a go to the front of the line price that can knock out some of your profit for many of all but the most expensive cards. And so you take that into account. I just find the grading thing fascinating. Like I said, I've been gone for 15 years of being retired, and the grading that was rolling along when I left is just speeding along now. Again, PSA is doing a great job. BGS is doing a great job. SGC is doing a great job. But there are opportunities for the savvy collector who can pre-grade his or her own cards and has a sharp eye and knows that one of the companies puts a more emphasis on centering or surface or whatever, and knows where to go. There are already people that are sharp-eyed and experienced that do that, and some used to work for the grading companies. So again, just a little insight about how grading is an inexact science, and you're best served by getting up to speed and educating your own eyeballs. So thanks, listeners. Thanks, everybody. Be back again tomorrow.